Well, thank you for coming back to hear the concluding lectures, and let's try and see the course through. Yes, still with the voice at the end, hopefully. Yesterday we explored a range of wonderful objects, of which many were sacrificed to funerary ends during the course of the early Metal Age. Most of this lecture is a detour away from burial, although I do return to it again at the end. It's crucial to say something about axes, strictly axe heads, for they are the backbone of the metalwork repertoire for the whole of this period. It is difficult for us today to appreciate what the axe meant to prehistoric people. For us, in the modern world, the axe is a rather basic and unexciting tool, functional and devoid of much sentimental value. But many scholars over recent decades have begun to recognise that axe heads could serve a far deeper and fundamental role in prehistory. This is not just a feature of the Bronze Age, but also of the Neolithic and other periods. But to acknowledge such long-lived significance over and above utility is not to assume that their meaning remains static over time. For our period of interest this weekend, axe heads are not only by far the most numerous category of metalwork, they are also beautifully crafted objects, often further embellished with faceted and punched decoration. So why should it be that such a dominant and value-added object was effectively kept apart from the funerary realm? This question becomes the more acute when we consider the current interpretation that the majority of axe heads were placed in ritual deposits. If they too could be used in ritual spheres of consumption, why so rarely in the major ritual preoccupation of the time, funerary presentation? Let us consider very briefly the preceding Neolithic. The case has been made by scholars such as Patton, Bradley, Edmonds and Cooney that polished stone and flint axe heads were intimately tied up not only with interregional connections because of the uneven distribution of suitable sources, but also with establishing personal status and interpersonal relations. Of course, these objects were undoubtedly put to utilitarian use. The argument is rarely that they were not used. But it is interesting to reflect on the utility of some. Based on experimental work by John Newbery, David Field comments that the flint that was won with great effort from deep mines may not in fact have been the most durable for chopping down trees. Because it had been protected from weathering, it had not become toughened as had surface deposits of flint. Material from, for example, the clay with flints is far more durable in chopping activities. This point may further reinforce the arguments made by some researchers that many particular sources of flint and stone came to be favoured because of the connotations of the places or because of perceived properties of the raw material other than functional qualities. This was argued most forcefully early on by Bradley and Edmonds in their explanation of why the sources of Group 6 rock used for vast numbers of stone axes were in such inaccessible locations high in the Langdale Pikes. But it can be applied equally to other extraction locations, including the deep mines for flint. The conclusion of this line of thinking is that particular sources came to be heavily exploited because they and their material were deemed to be special in the eyes of Neolithic communities, not because of any intrinsic utilitarian advantage over other materials, nor because they were more economic to exploit. So if we accept that axe heads had a certain specialness and centrality in the Neolithic, is it possible this position was simply continued into the Metal Age? There was no wholesale population change at the beginning of the Chalcolithic, so continuity is theoretically possible. At the same time, it is clear that the intrusion of Beaker people and their baggage set in train a complex sequence of changing cultural values among the population at large, and this certainly had the capacity to diminish, erase, or rewrite the role of the axe. Suitable stone or flint needed to make axe heads in the Neolithic, and the metal-yielding ore needed in the early Metal Age were united in coming from restricted sources. Inevitably, therefore, both materials relied on large-scale outward distribution of raw material or worked objects from the respective exploited sources. Even though the actual locations of the sources had obviously changed, substitution of metal for stone or flint need not at first have altered the way in which distribution was conducted. However, the recyclability of metal was one key factor that led inevitably to change. It has the potential for two major effects. The first is that the category of object, when made of copper or alloy, is extremely transformable. It is true that a flint axe can at any point in its use cycle be reworked into another class of object, for example an arrowhead, but this is of necessity a highly reductive process. The succeeding objects rapidly become smaller, and further utility of the raw material is soon expended. For metals, although there are small percentage losses at each recasting from vaporization and slagging, I hope you like our little think bubbles above the molten metal there, it is possible to create entirely new objects of almost comparable bulk. Moreover, by combining different objects together, the new casting can actually involve an increase in bulk, something impossible for lithic material. Someone who desired a metal axe head would be able to obtain it even if they only had daggers to hand. They might need 3 or 4 of them, and of course they would certainly need someone capable of melting and casting. And this bulking up can happen at any distance from the raw material sources. If a stone or flint axe breaks, it is necessary to obtain another from the supply chain. Ultimately, this must come from the source of the raw material concerned. If a metal axe becomes irreparably damaged, it can be replaced by the local metalworker, largely working with defunct objects in local circulation. So we can represent the metal system schematically like this. Just taking a limited passage of time, at the start of which there is this much metal in circulation. Every time there is recasting, there may be tiny incremental losses from vaporization, etc., those steps downwards. And every time new metal is imported into the region, there will be a little step upwards. The importation of metal is obviously essential because in the longer term to compensate for those losses. But in the shortish term, this need be only a minor proportion of what was being recycled into new castings overall. And we can see what proportion that might be. This is just one example, obviously, in the final column there, the colour balance between orange and green. So if newly imported metal was small in quantity relative to the extant stock, it could result in a major shift in perception. Metal could almost be regarded as a local resource, since new casting would have predominantly used material already within the local system. I've argued elsewhere that metalworkers were already becoming widely, albeit at first thinly, distributed across these islands, almost from the beginning of metallurgy. Recasting and recycling may be deduced almost as early. The altered perception I've just hypothesized need not have followed far behind. These effects of recyclability do not automatically make axe heads or any other metalwork type any more or less important than their lithic counterparts, but it certainly provides a basis for change in the underlying psychological conditions of the two systems, and that could have had a profound effect on how key constituent object types were regarded. Axe heads are by far the most common metalwork type across Britain and Ireland, as I've already said. This might at first sight make them seem to be a commonplace tool, frequently lost or abandoned across the landscape. However, there is a wide variety of evidence that suggests, firstly, that the axe head as a type had a great significance in the eyes of Metal Age society, and secondly, that it's far from casually treated. I'm going to outline these 5 categories of evidence, starting with redundant aspects of form. It is easy to see technological progress in the periodically changing form of early Metal Age axes. I hope you like the march of axes here. The steady improvement of features to facilitate secure hafting. The sequence establishes the progressive addition of stop features and side flanges, these accompanied by a narrowing of the body to suit a new form of haft. You can see some of the terminology used for features in the inset box. But there are also a number of features that defy any rational explanation in terms of functional utility. I will start with one very basic one, the widths of cutting edges on one particular type, the Killaher type, named after a hoard in County Kerry. Killaher axes are distinguished by their unusually broad cutting edges, both in absolute terms and relative to body length. They present fine-looking blades capable of a goodly cutting stroke. The puzzle, though, is that this type was only produced over about 2 centuries. Before and after that, there were no standardized types with equivalent edge breadth. One might conjecture that they had a specialized function, but it's hard to imagine what could have applied to just that window of time. Such broad edges were never returned to, even when we take in all of the Middle and Late Bronze Age axe types. It must be surmised, therefore, that the Killaher type reflects a style fashion. Within that given period and within its geographical and social spheres of use, it was a highly desirable look for an axe head. Another redundant aspect of form is seen in the recurving of blade tips on a good number of period 4 flanged axes. While expansion of blade tips can be a natural consequence of resharpening the cutting edge by hammering, a feature found on many types of axe head to some degree, the extraordinary expansions sometimes seen on these Araton axes cannot be thus dismissed. These are deliberate creations, some at least more or less cast to that shape, a feature that seems all the more extraordinary when it is considered how vulnerable they would be to breakage during use or even accidental clashes, since these very same axe heads have relatively high tin contents, which would have made them more brittle than usual. You can see the distribution of tin contents, I hope, in the bottom right. Now, the second category of evidence is about embellishment and decoration. The phenomenon of decorating axe heads has been well studied in various ways. The decoration of an object type that had obvious utilitarian capacity is always intriguing. It is essentially yet another redundant aspect of form, like those I've just described. There is a long sequence of embellished and decorated axe heads in Britain and Ireland, covering most of the early Metal Age. It follows an insular trajectory in terms of both design evolution and the growing intensity of its application. Even copper axe heads often have neat shaping that goes beyond pure functional requirements. The example here on the left. Some could be put down to the desire for a high finish, but this hardly accounts for the neat, shallow furrow immediately above the edge bevel on this example from Purdis Farm and a number of others. This feature may have arisen first from resharpening the blade at a very different angle from before, but it quickly became exploited for its visual effect. A further but unusual embellishment that can be added to the repertoire is the tinning of surfaces, which is especially well known on some Scottish examples of early period 2 date. It's quite a short-lived phenomenon, mind you. There was clearly a ceaseless desire to make axe heads look good. The origins of decoration may lie in an opportunistic grasping of the potential of using post-cast working to add surface effects. We have already seen this potential being grasped in the case of the furrow-backed edge bevel. A little later, that came to be translated into one of the earliest of the more formal decorative schemes. Sometimes the furrows remained horizontal, as in the example top-middle, but others splay parallel to the expanding sides of the body, top right. Another early design that may be familiar to you is rain pattern decoration. This could have emerged when metalworkers saw the potential of indentations made accidentally and randomly at first on objects undergoing finishing. Indeed, there are a few axe heads, like the Manor Farm example, bottom left, with limited fields of punch marks which look like nascent decoration. In fact, it is possible to identify 4 further emergent themes of face decoration on British and Irish axe heads. These all based on punched strokes, like the plain rain pattern. It's a good job we're not dealing with Spain, isn't it? Plain rain Spain, goodness me. These 4 additional ones are a zoned rain pattern, you can see top right, and then along the bottom row, splayed lines of dots or strokes, sometimes zigzagged, herringbone, and finally fir foliage. All of these more formalised design themes take off around the middle of period 2. Indeed, it was not only faces that saw increasing ornamentation. Many axe heads of period 2 had simple longitudinal faceted sides, and by the period's end, a more sophisticated design, a string of lozenge facets, had been devised. It is tempting to see the lozenges as another echo of the cultural importance of strings of fusiform beads, as we featured in Lecture 4. Although Ireland has yielded a greater absolute number of decorated axe heads, this may simply reflect the higher recovery of axe heads generally there. In proportional terms, there are just as many decorated examples in Britain, and there are equally early examples, as you can see in this plot, of all of those belonging to period 2. So it is not clear which region, if either, should be credited with the formalisation of decoration. There are, incidentally, some differences of emphasis in the distribution of the various early designs I showed, which may suggest they were the creation of different schools of metalworkers. We don't have time to look into that in detail today. To see the frequency of decoration over time, it is necessary to use only axe heads with well-preserved surfaces. I've done this for southern Britain, and I'm sure the same trend will be found in the north and in Ireland. It transpires that there was an inexorable rise in the proportion embellished or decorated, which peaks at over 90% of all axe heads in periods 3 and early 4. This histogram includes those with relatively simple faceting, the paler blue colour, and that obviously accounts for all of the period 1 examples, the copper ones, but actually becomes more important again in period 4. You can see that very few axe heads of the later 2 periods lacked any embellishment at all. Decoration obviously gave some kind of added value to axe heads, but it was not always visible. A proportion had decoration applied to their haft ends, as well as or instead of the exposed blade faces. When neat designs are found there, we can be sure that this was not a question of providing grip for the haft. Yet some are clearly more worn there relative to the blade, so they had been mounted for use. One conclusion might be that the symbolic value of the decoration transcended its visibility. It was enough that the maker and the possessor of the axe, and perhaps others too, presumably others too, knew the full extent of the decoration. Perhaps it had been marvelled at prior to mounting in the haft. But this brings us on to the third category of evidence, for there is another possibility that axe heads could also have had an unhafted mode of use during which their display potential was exploited and their symbolic value paramount. This possibility is brought home by the exceptional survival of a leather pouch enclosing a decorated axe head from Brocker, County Kildare. Of course, it is possible that this particular deposit merely reflects the carriage of an axe head not yet put into use. But a vital connection can be made with carved representations of axes. In the 6 sites with carvings recognised thus far, every single axe head depicted is presented without a haft. There are the 3 well-known sites in the Kilmartin Valley and another possible example 20 kilometres up the west coast at Kilbride. Equally well known are the 2 Wessex sites, Stonehenge in Wiltshire and the Badbury Barrow in Dorset. The 2 Wessex sites all have daggers, though at Stonehenge it is a single example absolutely swamped by axe heads. Meanwhile, Rhind has, at the opposite end of the kist from the axe heads, an enigmatic design that Trevor Cowie and I now believe to be a palimpsest. I mentioned it yesterday. We are now convinced that the final addition was indeed a halberd, a suggestion that had been tentatively made before. Significantly, this halberd and the Wessex carved daggers are complete with their hafts, despite their association with unhafted axe heads. Another curiosity of these carvings is that all sites except Stonehenge, they appear in or beside burial chambers. It might have seemed more natural in this context to focus on metalwork types that were seen to be fitting for a burial, especially if they were intended to serve as surrogate grave goods. Instead, they seem to stand for something outside of normal burial rites, though it might still be the case that they referred to an aspect of the individual interred or his or her community. For example, it is tempting to see the community of the Kilmartin Valley as being deeply involved in the metal exchange chain that brought copper across the North Channel from Ireland. If they cannot be interpreted as surrogate funerary deposits, another suggestion is that these sets of carvings represent surrogate hoards, since they so obviously parallel the composition of contemporary hoards. The labour and expertise invested in the carving might be deemed a fitting alternative to the consumption of precious metal. But it is equally feasible that they portray sets of axe heads circulating in the systemic sphere, or that they were accretive carvings, each axe being carved to mark some critical occasion that recurred from time to time. Despite these interpretive uncertainties, we can draw the key message that when it was important to depict metalwork in carved form, it was the axe head that headed the symbolic roll call. Fraught with difficulty though it may be, for some were evidently highly stylized, it is nevertheless worth looking at the possible identifications of the axe heads carved. From site to site, the carved axes are rather disparate in detailed shape, which may reflect the fact that they are rare manifestations spaced out in time and place. Most emphasize the cutting edge, at times probably exaggerating it, thus giving disproportionate weight to the feature that essentially defines the potency and efficacy of the object. The precise nature of the body may have been less important to the carvers, sometimes being fairly faithfully rendered, sometimes not. This has to be judged for each shape by comparison with known metalwork types. The essentially triangular shape with pointed butts of the Badbury axe heads, bottom left, makes them amongst the most stylized and problematic to identify. On the other hand, Those well enough preserved of the many depictions at Stonehenge have long been recognised to portray axes with crescentic cutting ends which expand dramatically from narrow bodies. This feature and the general character of the bodies are consistent with both period 4 axes and a small subset of those of the previous period. There is little doubt, therefore, that the Stonehenge carvings were added to the respective Sarsen uprights long after they had been erected, perhaps 1800 to 1500 BC. As Andrew Lawson has ventured, and I quote, "Even the images of such objects could be used to imply certain powers. Adding carvings of axes and a dagger to the stones of Stonehenge may thus have been a mechanism for modifying the monument in such a way that it maintained its prestige and potency." In the Kilmartin Valley, in mid-Argyll, 3 sites are spread out over as little as 1.3 kilometres, and yet present varied axe forms. The Netherlargy North axe heads also look stylised. Some feature broad bodies running up to a broad butt, thus similar to early copper axe heads as suggested by Simpson and Thorley. But others are more narrow-butted, and we may have varied forms represented on this one slab. That's the roof slab. Here, on the roof, they're superimposed upon a constellation of cut marks. But a pair of axe heads occurs on the end slab of the same kist. The specific juxtaposition there of 2 of different size and shape is intriguingly reminiscent of juxtapositions seen on certain univalve mould finds. I show one of the Herbuck moulds here. Netherlargy Mid only has one identifiable axe head, a very shallow-pecked carving difficult to define fully. Nevertheless, it could easily represent a classic Mickdale axe. Perhaps more confidence can be attached to the identification of the 8 examples at Rhind. The bodies flare rapidly from narrow butts to end in expanded, extremely broad and gently curved cutting edges. In fact, these characteristics allow a specific identity to be suggested, for they look every bit like the distinctive broad-edged Kiloher axe heads we have already discussed. I show them here alongside parts of 2 Irish hoards containing that type, in a photograph carefully contrived by Mary Cahill. The existence of 3 such sets in the same small valley, and all incorporated into burial chambers, suggests persuasively that there was continuity of tradition, perhaps over a number of generations, spanning the transition from period 1 to period 2. The special character of the few sites with carved axe heads leads us to consider the depositional locations of actual axe heads. Just as enigmatic are rare examples of axe heads placed in or beside funerary mounds. Willoughby Wold is perhaps the classic example of a mound deposit, but the motivation behind such occasional placements is unclear. The multiple hoards at Dalnacurra near Fort William, and perhaps some others, were placed in natural mounds that may have seemed indistinguishable from man-made ones. We may be less equivocal about the position of the fine decorated axe head placed low in the ditch fill of the Great Henge at Mount Pleasant, close to the western entrance. It dates to about the 20th century BC, much the time at which an enormous palisade enclosure was constructed inside the line of the ditch, and I've suggested elsewhere that the axe head may have symbolised and celebrated the considerable felling, trimming and jointing of timber involved in that enterprise. These, though, are only the very tip of the iceberg. Most deposits of single or multiple objects are not placed in obvious relationship to contemporary ritual sites. Among them, though, are deposits put in wet places, at cultural boundaries, or in prominent landscape settings, such as discussed by Trevor Cowie for Scottish examples. Dunsapie Crag find serves us again. Such locations, and perhaps many others, could have been deeply significant to the depositors, helping structure relationships between living communities and between them and the spirit world. And now to our 5th category. Another indication of the symbolic importance of axes may be seen in a series of axe-like objects which would not have been effective as axes per se, but could in some cases have had a function as metalworking stones or polishers. Francis Lynch has drawn attention to some of them recently. The shape of an example, such as from Penicuic, Midlothian, which matches closely that of trapezoid copper axes, is strongly suggestive of an early date. And there are in fact a number of axe-like polishers in grave contexts. The two examples in my slide at the bottom are representative of their associations with either beakers or with food vessels. These blocks are not necessarily all of the same character and function, but they do suggest a tradition of creating axe-shaped working stones, probably derived from continental Europe, where similar stones occur at an early date. In the case of those used as metalworking implements, it is difficult to see a specific functional reason for making them axe-shaped, especially when one bears in mind that there were many contemporary, more rectanguloid blocks, working blocks known as cushion stones. Axe-like blocks could then suggest that there was an important symbolic connection between the practice of metalworking and axe heads in general. Any of those strands of evidence taken individually may not be terribly compelling, but I think we can see that from the conjunction of all of them, that axe heads in the early Metal Age were regarded as rather special objects with a symbolic significance that went well beyond their utilitarian use. This has been said by several researchers now over a number of years, so it may not come as a surprise to you. At the same time, opinion has swung in favour of the great majority of axe deposits, both hoards and singly found examples, being of deliberate ritual intent. Yet somewhat strangely, these deposits were kept almost totally divorced from the major preoccupation of the time, that obsession with funerary rituals. How do we account for this parallel stream of existence? Many years ago I suggested that axe deposition served a different and parallel role in early Metal Age society, that they were community-serving deposits as distinct from the personalised contents of the contemporary burials. This is a plausible distinction, but we would need to develop a clearer understanding of how the supposed community service worked and what its objectives were. And we also need to re-examine the relationship to the parallel funerary phenomenon. If the formal burials that appear to highlight the enhancement of the individual are in fact the results of strategic decisions relating to ensuring harmonious relations with the otherworld, then these too are community endeavours in more than just participation in the funeral. So I no longer see the individual-community opposition as a sufficient explanation for these parallel streams of existence. A case can be made that axe heads were central to the system of distributing metal, whether this be primary metal from the sources or secondary metal, that is, the stuff that has been remelted and recast at least once. I should say that there is a little evidence for the distribution of raw metal in the early Metal Age, that is, metal not yet cast into a recognisable object. Ingot material is known from just 3 Irish hoards, and their rarity as archaeological finds suggests such metal was quickly transformed into objects or object blanks, and that much of the onward distribution of metal to spread it throughout Ireland and Britain was done in object form. Objects themselves can thus in effect be ingots, and this might apply to both cast blanks not yet finished for use and the finished products. We cannot wholly rule out some metal having been moved direct from the exploited sources to regions of use at whatever distance. However, a strong component of down-the-line exchange is almost inevitable, and then we have to remember the ongoing utility of metal through recycling, which gives the capacity for the material to remain in circulation much longer, with further prospects for interregional transmission. In aggregate, it is probable that most metal distribution followed the pattern of flow I have described in the past, in which material moved in aggregate outwards from the sources, from one pool of circulation to another, in a kind of Brownian motion. The picture gets more complicated if we try to envisage the object forms that in general make up this pattern of movements. This is most easily portrayed linearly with a logarithmic scale for distance along the top of this chart, this diagram. We can break down the metal objects into 4 categories, as you can see down the side here. It can be predicted that most ore was smelted very locally, and the distribution of raw smelted metal, the second tier down, fell away rapidly with distance. It would usually have been converted quickly into some kind of casting in the immediate environs of the source or its region, and thus we drop down to the third tier. This determines the initial distribution of first cast objects, but these too will then be subject to potential movement in aggregate outwards. Those first castings could be specific forms whose main function was as a medium for exchange, i.e. ingots, and or they could be functioning objects put into use. Either way, the object sooner or later gets melted down and recast, either because the initial object has worn out or broken, or because it crosses to a zone where style preferences were different. In reality, the lowest tier here shows the sum of multiple successive recastings of the metal, and I've tried to indicate this with the circular arrows within. Let's see what such a system might look like in terms of actual objects for the crucial output of copper from Ross Island in period 1. The primary distribution of copper is likely to have been in the form of Loch-Ravel type axe heads, as suggested some while ago by Peter Northover. Accepting what I said earlier, that there's maybe small amounts of actual ingot, uncast ingot, distributing outwards, I think the primary form of distribution is in the form of Loch-Ravel axe heads. They are often rather poorly formed, and although some were sharpened up for use, it would seem that by degrees they were converted into neater axe heads as well as into other objects. On this model, therefore, the Loch-Ravel objects serving as both axes and ingots would progressively give way to other forms as they moved outwards from the source region. We're looking now at the third and fourth tiers. This is certainly clear once Ross Island copper reached Britain, where very few Loch-Ravel axe heads have been found, and yet the great majority of contemporary metalwork is believed to be made from copper from that source. We need to say a little bit more about cast blanks. Like raw metal, there are few unequivocal finds, and these are mostly Irish. So, for example, there is the pair of blanks of Killaher axe heads found on the shores of the Knockadoon Peninsula. They're on the right. Another relatively recent find is a hoard originally of 3 from Crubeen in County Laois. These are blanks for broad-butted and therefore presumably copper axe heads, which seem to have had some post-cast working but were not yet finished products. Such blanks in themselves are ambiguous on the matter of distribution. While they might suggest the distribution of metal in the form of unfinished objects, they could just as easily be examples of local production, since every single object, wherever it was cast, had to start as a blank. The blanks lead us conveniently to matrices on moulds, for it is well known that we have a good series of stone univalve moulds from the early Metal Age. Actually, this series represents little more than one phase of metalworking, and probably only certain elements within that phase. Casting in the Chalcolithic, for example, seems to have been virtually entirely in sand or clay moulds that do not survive or have not yet been recognized. Halberds undoubtedly require fairly sophisticated bivalve moulds, and by 2000 BC, stone moulds, the univalve stone moulds, went out of favour again. So opting for a stone mould technology might have had some advantages, but it was not so advantageous that it overrode all other considerations. This phase of stone mould use is, of course, deeply bound up with the Migdale-Marnock metalworking system of northeast Scotland. I suggested several years ago that the technology was adopted as part of a package that gave a unique definition to the given production system. Its success in the core production zone was such that the system was emulated elsewhere. Despite the importance of stone moulds to the identity of Migdale-Marnock metalworking, however, they were not necessarily the sole means of casting to judge from the balance of object types represented. Although 8 categories of matrix for different object types can be identified on the moulds, axe heads account for as many as 53% of all matrices. This is an overwhelming preponderance. Axe heads are rarely absent from moulds of this period, and frequently they are multiplied on a single mould block. The highest number is 6 on the block from Ballyglassheen in County Carlow, followed closely by 5 on that from Dunor in County Cork, that's not shown, and 4 at Wallybourne in Shropshire. Rather than viewing the assemblage of matrices found collectively on the moulds as a faithful record of production, it may be that we should think instead in terms of them being chosen to represent what was symbolically most important to the metalworkers, and perhaps to society at large. Thus the mould blocks could have served a more conceptual progenitor role, as well as being one means of producing objects. And the dominance of the axe heads in these substantial and durable carved blocks would suggest its conceptual centrality. One thing tacitly assumed thus far is that the local community essentially owned the metal they had in circulation. This needs qualification. Ethnographic analogy teaches us that it was not normal in pre-state societies to regard material, especially valuables, as being owned by people. Instead, it continued to belong to the gods during its time in the possession of people, and ultimately it needed to be returned to the supernatural world. It was the miners and the smiths that initially won and transformed this otherworld material, thus giving it earthly existence. They were the agents on earth of the gods and spirits that permitted exploitation and temporary custody, hence their often ambivalent status in society, as noted by writers such as Rowlands and Budden Taylor. But the metalworkers continued to play an intermediary role at each episode of recasting. They took in old objects and later presented entirely new forms to the living community. Now, from the community's perspective, the old objects were effectively sent back to their otherworld origins. In return came new products with the sanction of the spirits and the gods. In other words, the process that we see mechanically as recycling took place in the closed realm of the metalworkers and could be construed instead by them as a process of exchange with the other world. Thus it may have been deemed essential to make use of the metalworkers as the conduit also for return offerings in the form of deliberate deposits of metalwork that we call hoards. If returning objects to the metalworker's domain was indeed proxy to returning it to the other world, then the critical decision on the balance between rejuvenation into new objects and sacrifice to the gods, as expressed here by the 2 red arrows, might well have depended on negotiation between the metalworkers and the other world. But community leaders must often have also had a big say on the context and place of permanent deposition. If we think about, for example, hoards placed at territorial boundaries. When deposition takes place, it completes the more fundamental recycling necessary between this world and the Otherworld. I've slightly reorientated the Otherworld. It's gone stage left. Sorry, you have to shift your mindset to compensate. But the purple theme picks up from the last slide. This is a speculative model as to how metal may have been flowing between categories of people and between worlds. But it also poses important questions about the relationship of metal workers to broader society, and I shall illustrate this with two models. One relationship often considered sees the metalworkers as effectively tied by patronage to the elite of communities. Organisationally, they are therefore situated on spurs off the side of the chain of exchange linkages and are dependent on the community for supply for new production. Bulk metal exchange in this model would take place between other members of society, conceivably exchange specialists, if not the elite themselves. But if we follow the model I've been outlining a little earlier, with the metalworkers playing a vital intermediary role, it could mean that the interregional passage of metal was now largely transmitted through the metalworkers' networks, with axe heads being the primary currency of transactions. This presents us with a radically different organisational structure. In both these models, the metalworking groups have a degree of power over society, and that only they could work the magic of transformation. But in this latter scenario, they would have been vested with much more control, having responsibility not only for success in production, but also for successful exchange transactions within the systemic sphere, and those with the Otherworld on behalf of the wider community. While I refer to this as control, we should be conscious of the likelihood that they would have been charged by the supernatural order to undertake this role. It was something they could not shirk, and was every bit as essential to being a successful metalworker as was the ability to transform metal. So I'm suggesting that the metalworking domain was the main conduit of the passage of metal between the systemic sphere and the Otherworld. It may also have held a monopoly over bulk transactions within the systemic sphere. Secondly, I see axe heads as constituting the main medium of such transactions. On these premises, the deposits of metalwork dotted across the landscape can be viewed as just part of the cycling of metal to and from the originating Otherworld. This process was conducted by metalworkers because of their intermediary or liminal status, but was nevertheless always done on behalf of society at large, and probably respected commonly held rules on exploitation, possession, and reclamation. If axe heads formed the spine of the complex transactions which negotiated the flow of metal not only through earthly space but also between this world and the Otherworld, then this provides potential explanations for their enduring symbolic importance and the many special features and contexts noted earlier. This can also explain why axe heads are very largely excluded from grave groups. They are too connected to the metalworking realm and to the underpinning economic cum cosmological structure. As such, they are too generic. They do not in themselves specify a category of person, so they are of limited value in funerary presentation. If anything, their inclusion in the grave might imply to the Otherworld hosts that the newly deceased was a part of the metalworking realm, and that might be a falsehood. I can only surmise that the general lack of metalworkers' graves in Britain and Ireland, and possible examples are generally ambiguous, derives from their liminal position. Those operating as metalworkers were in the service of and already connected to the Otherworld, and may not thus have been seen as requiring funerary presentation. This discussion does, of course, force us to consider what was implied by the rare inclusion of axes in graves. Of all the thousands of excavated burials in Britain and Ireland, only a dozen had axe heads or their diminutives as grave goods. And it is significant that in almost every case they accompany other, more regular funerary signifiers, such as daggers or knives. They fall into two discrete geographic and chronological groups. 5 of period 2 date come from northern England, and a 6th is the poorly recorded grave at Aylesford in Kent. Only one of these is a diminutive, and otherwise they are serviceable axe heads. A further 7 date to period 3 and come instead from Wessex and Wales. All but one of these are rather diminutive axe heads, and even the full-size example from Bush Barrow is unusual in its fineness. The high proportion of diminutives in this phase group suggests a degree of tokenism. They were important as representations rather than necessarily as functioning objects. Their presence might be taken to imply the buried individuals were metalworkers, and certainly the curious nature of the grave assemblage from Wilsford G58, top left, could indicate an incumbent of unusual status or an unusual message to the otherworld. But we need also to take into account foreign influences in this later group. It is known that there were some Armorican influences on period 3 Wessex, and the better furnished Armorican burials frequently included axes. It is highly significant, therefore, that the Wilsford G58 example is itself of Armorican type. So, in conclusion, I would suggest that axe heads came to symbolise everything to do with the metalworking sphere, and more, they provided a common understanding across society at large. They formed a backbone that connected source with social use, smith with community, and otherworld with this world. They gave potency to varied rituals that helped articulate that backbone, for they were the ultimate symbol of the magical material of metal in its transformed state. They were a fundamental currency of exchange, facilitating social as much as material transactions between alloyed groups. They were imbued with the correct properties for gifting back to the gods, and they were an emblem of which an image, an imitation, or a diminutive version might be sufficient in appropriate contexts to convey a powerful meaning. But one major consequence of these relationships and meanings was that axes and axe heads were generally not eligible as funerary offerings. Instead, it was they that were the overwhelming choice for metalwork deposited across the landscape in hoards and as single finds, on land or in wet places, as part of different ritual concerns. In a short while, we will return for my last lecture, during which I'll try to pull together some of the strands that I've teased out of the complex evidence relating to the early Metal Age. This will be a return in force to the funerary phenomenon, but I hope you will retain from this lecture, combined with those elements of earlier ones dealing with halberds and axe hammers, some sense that funerary obsessions did not represent the whole gamut of ritual in the early Metal Age. Thank you.